On September 15, 2024, Harold Finch walked into the Millbrook Police Department, carrying a manila envelope and a confession that would unravel 43 years of carefully buried secrets. The groundskeeper had maintained the Harris estate since 1981, pruning hedges, clearing gutters, and keeping the massive Victorian property in pristine condition. He was known around town as a quiet man who kept to himself, paid his taxes on time, and never missed Sunday service at St. Michael's Church. What Harold Finch hadn't told anyone was that for over 4 decades, he had been the sole caretaker of something far more disturbing than an aging mansion, something that lived beneath the Harris Estates Foundation, in a basement that appeared on no architectural plans, no city records, and no building permits, something that required feeding every 3 days, without exception. The envelope Harold placed on Detective Sarah Morrison's desk contained 43 years' worth of meticulously documented entries, names, dates, physical descriptions, and methods of disposal. 147 people had vanished in Millbrook County since 1981. Harold Finch knew exactly where they had gone, because he had been the one to deliver them, but Harold wasn't a killer. He was something far more complicated than that. He was a keeper of an ancient hunger that had been passed down through generations of groundskeepers, each sworn to secrecy, each bound by circumstances that made refusal impossible. And after 43 years of faithful service, Harold Finch had finally decided that some secrets were too heavy for one man to carry. This is the story of what lived beneath the Harris estate, and why Harold Finch spent nearly half a century feeding it the people of Millbrook County, one missing person at a time. My name is Rebecca Chen, and I've spent the last 8 months investigating one of the most disturbing cases in Pacific Northwest history. What began as research into a series of cold case disappearances in rural Oregon became something far more complex when Harold Finch walked into that police station last September. His confession opened a door into a world that challenges everything we understand about rural American communities, generational trauma, and the lengths people will go to protect the only life they've ever known. The Harris estate sits on 230 acres of dense woodland 15 miles outside Millbrook, Oregon. Built in 1897 by lumber baron Cornelius Harris, the mansion had been abandoned for decades when Harold Finch was hired as its groundskeeper in 1981. The Harris family trust paid him a modest salary to maintain the property while they decided what to do with their inheritance. What Harold discovered in those first weeks on the job would define the rest of his life. Over the course of several interviews conducted at the Oregon State Penitentiary, Harold Finch told me his story with a matter-of-fact calmness that was both unsettling and oddly compelling. He spoke about his decades of service with something approaching pride, describing his work as necessary, even noble. Harold Finch genuinely believed he had been protecting the people of Millbrook County, even as he systematically fed them to something that should not have existed. This is Harold's story, told in his own words and supplemented by police records, missing person reports, and forensic evidence that confirms the impossible. It's a story about duty, survival, and the terrible choices we make when faced with circumstances beyond our control or understanding. Harold Finch was 27 years old when he answered the classified ad in the Millbrook Daily Herald. The Harris Family Trust was seeking a groundskeeper for their estate, someone willing to live on the property and maintain it in exchange for room, board, and a modest salary. Harold had just been laid off from the sawmill where he'd worked since high school, and the isolation of the Harris estate appealed to him. He'd never been comfortable around people, preferring the company of trees and tools to the complexities of human interaction. The interview took place in the offices of Brennan and Associates, the law firm that managed the Harris Trust. Margaret Brennan, the senior partner, was a severe woman in her 60s who seemed to be sizing Harold up for something more than basic groundskeeping duties. She asked unusual questions about his family ties to the area, whether he planned to marry or have children, and how he felt about long-term commitments. When Harold mentioned that his parents had died in a car accident the previous year and that he had no siblings or close relatives, Margaret Brennan's demeanor shifted noticeably. She offered him the job on the spot, along with a contract that included several unusual clauses. Harold would be required to live on the property year-round, with vacation time limited to 3 days per month. He was forbidden from bringing guests to the estate without prior approval from the trust. Most importantly, he was required to maintain absolute confidentiality about anything he discovered on the property, with severe financial penalties for any breach of this agreement. Harold signed without reading the fine print. He needed the job, and the idea of living alone on a sprawling estate surrounded by forest felt like a gift rather than a burden. Margaret Brennan handed him the keys and a thick manila folder containing maintenance schedules, contact information for local contractors, and what she described as special instructions that he should read carefully once he'd settled in the Harris estate was even more impressive in person than it had been in the newspaper photographs. The three-story Victorian mansion featured elaborate gingerbread trim, wraparound porches, and stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns across hardwood floors. The grounds included formal gardens, a carriage house, and several outbuildings scattered throughout the property. Everything was in remarkable condition for a house that had been empty for over a decade. Harold spent his first week exploring the estate and familiarizing himself with the maintenance requirements. The house itself was fully furnished but covered in dust sheets, giving it the feel of a museum waiting to be reopened. The grounds required constant attention, with miles of hiking trails, ornamental ponds, and carefully manicured lawns that extended deep into the surrounding forest. It was on his 8th day at the estate that Harold discovered the special instructions. Margaret Brennan had mentioned the manila folder contained routine maintenance schedules for the first several pages, but buried near the back was a section titled Basement Protocols that made Harold's blood run cold. According to the instructions, there was a basement beneath the mansion that was not accessible through the main house. The entrance was located in the carriage house, hidden behind a false wall that could be opened using a specific sequence of movements on seemingly decorative wooden panels. Harold was instructed to enter this basement every 3 days, following precise safety protocols, to perform what the document euphemistically called feeding maintenance. The instructions were detailed and specific. Harold was to enter the basement alone, always during daylight hours, carrying a battery-powered lantern and a canvas bag containing suitable provisions. He was never to speak or make unnecessary noise while in the basement. He was to place the provisions in a designated area and leave immediately, sealing the entrance behind him. Under no circumstances was he to attempt to explore the basement beyond the designated feeding area. The final page of the instructions contained a handwritten note from someone identified only as EF, presumably Harold's predecessor as groundskeeper. The note was brief but chilling. "I know this seems impossible, but it is real and it is necessary. If you fail to maintain the feeding schedule, it will find another way to satisfy its hunger. The people of Millbrook are depending on you, even though they will never know it. I am sorry to leave you with this burden, but I can no longer carry it alone." Harold read the instructions 3 times, convinced he was misunderstanding something fundamental. The document spoke about feeding schedules and provisions, but never specified what was being fed or what constituted suitable provisions. The clinical language made it sound like routine animal care, but the secrecy and safety protocols suggested something far more dangerous. Harold spent 2 days working up the courage to investigate the basement. The rational part of his mind insisted that the instructions were some kind of elaborate prank or test, possibly designed to see if he would follow orders without question. But something about the handwritten note, with its tone of genuine regret and exhaustion, suggested otherwise. On his 3rd day, Harold followed the instructions to access the hidden entrance in the carriage house. The false wall opened icily once he found the correct sequence of panel movements, revealing a narrow stone staircase that descended into complete darkness. The air that rose from the basement was thick and humid, carrying a smell that Harold would later describe as a mixture of wet earth, decay, and something else he couldn't identify but instinctively recognized as dangerous. Harold descended the stairs slowly, his battery-powered lantern casting wild shadows on the rough stone walls. The basement was larger than he had expected, extending well beyond the footprint of the carriage house above. The ceiling was low and supported by massive wooden beams that looked far older than the rest of the estate. The floor was dirt, packed hard by decades of use, and scattered with what looked like bones dot at the far end of the basement. Harold found the designated feeding area mentioned in the instructions. It was simply a clear space in the center of the room, marked by a circle of stones arranged on the ground. Inside the circle, the dirt was darker and more recently disturbed, as if something had been buried and dug up multiple times. Harold placed his lantern at the edge of the circle and waited, following the instructions to remain silent and still. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then he began to hear sounds from deeper in the basement, beyond the reach of his lantern's glow. Scratching sounds, like claws on stone, wet, sliding noises that suggested something large moving across the dirt floor, and underneath it all, a low vibration that he felt more than heard, like a massive heartbeat echoing through the earth. The creature that emerged from the darkness was unlike anything Harold had ever seen or imagined. It moved with a fluid, serpentine motion, but its body seemed to shift and change as it moved, making it impossible to determine its exact size or shape. What Harold could see in the flickering lantern light was enough to send him backing toward the stairs, his heart pounding and his hands shaking. The creature was massive, easily 15 feet long, with what appeared to be multiple sets of limbs that emerged and retracted as needed. Its skin was pale and translucent, revealing the movement of internal organs beneath. But it was the creature's face that would haunt Harold's dreams for decades to come. Where there should have been eyes, there were instead deep pits that seemed to draw in light rather than reflect it. Its mouth was a lipless gash filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth that extended far back into its throat. The creature approached the stone circle cautiously, its movements becoming more agitated as it searched for the provisions that Harold had failed to bring. When it found nothing, it raised its head and fixed those terrible empty sockets directly on Harold. For a moment that felt like hours, they stared at each other across the basement. Then the creature opened its mouth and released a sound that was part scream, part roar, and part something far worse, a noise that seemed to bypass Harold's ears and speak directly to the most primitive parts of his brain. Harold ran. He stumbled up the stairs, slammed the false wall closed behind him, and didn't stop running until he reached the main house. He spent the rest of the day locked in the master bedroom, trying to convince himself that what he had seen was a hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But deep down, Harold knew it was real, and he knew that he would have to go back. The next morning, Harold found a note slipped under his door. It was written in the same handwriting as the previous groundskeeper's message, but the paper was fresh and the ink was still slightly wet. Someone had been watching him, had known about his failure to bring provisions, and was now providing guidance. The note was direct and practical. Check the carriage house workshop. Everything you need is there. Start with the transients. They won't be missed immediately. The town drunk, the drifters, the ones who live on the margins. Make it look like they left town voluntarily. The creature will accept any human offering, but freshness matters. Never let more than 3 days pass between feedings. Harold found the workshop exactly where the note indicated, in a section of the carriage house he hadn't fully explored. It contained tools he recognized: shovels, rope, tarps, and others that took him longer to understand. Restraints, sedatives, a detailed map of Millbrook County with certain locations marked in red, indicating good places to find suitable subjects, or dispose of evidence. Most disturbing of all was a leather-bound journal filled with decades of entries documenting feeding schedules, subject selection, and disposal methods. The handwriting changed periodically, indicating that multiple groundskeepers had contributed to the record over the years. The earliest entries dated back to 1923, just a few years after the mansion was built. Harold spent hours reading through the journal, trying to understand the scope of what he had inherited. Each groundskeeper had developed their own methods for finding subjects, but all had followed the same basic principles. Target people who wouldn't be missed immediately. Make their disappearances look voluntary or accidental. Never take more than one person per month to avoid establishing a pattern. Always feed the creature exactly every 3 days, regardless of circumstances. The journal entries revealed the psychological toll the work took on each groundskeeper. Early entries were clinical and detached, but as the months and years passed, they became increasingly emotional. Groundskeepers wrote about their guilt, their fear, and their desperate attempts to find alternatives to human sacrifice. Several had tried feeding the creature animals instead, but these attempts had invariably failed. The creature required human flesh, and it could somehow distinguish between willing and unwilling offerings. One entry, written by a groundskeeper identified only as RM, in 1967, provided crucial insight into the creatures. Nature attempted to research the entity through local historical records, found references in Native American oral traditions to a hunger spirit that was supposedly bound to this land centuries ago. The stories speak of a creature that feeds on human life force as well as flesh, growing stronger with each offering. Local tribes avoided this area entirely, calling it the place where the earth eats men. The Harris family built their mansion directly on top of what the tribes considered a sacred prison. Another entry, from 1974, described what happened when a groundskeeper failed to maintain the feeding schedule. Creature escaped containment after missing 2 feeding cycles. Found evidence of its presence throughout the county over the following weeks. 7 people vanished in 12 days before I could lure it back to the basement with a fresh offering. The local police blamed the disappearances on a serial killer, who was never caught. They have no idea how close they came to losing the entire town. Harold understood that he wasn't just maintaining a property. He was serving as the last line of defense between a supernatural predator and the innocent people of Millbrook County. The weight of this responsibility, combined with the terrible nature of what it required, would have driven many people to madness or suicide. But Harold was a pragmatic man who had learned early in life that survival sometimes required making impossible choices. He would do what was necessary to protect the town, even if it meant becoming something he had never imagined he could become. The first subject, Harold's first feeding, took place on October 3rd, 1981, 3 weeks after he discovered the basement. He had spent those weeks learning the patterns and habits of Millbrook's most vulnerable residents, identifying potential subjects who fit the criteria outlined in the journal. His target was Thomas Kellerman, a 54-year-old alcoholic who lived in a rundown trailer on the outskirts of town. Thomas had no family, no steady employment, and no close relationships. He was known to disappear for days at a time on drinking binges, often hitchhiking to neighboring towns before eventually wandering back to Millbrook. Most importantly, Thomas had mentioned to several people that he was thinking about heading south for the winter, looking for construction work in warmer climates. Harold approached the task with the same methodical planning he brought to all his work. He studied Thomas's routines, identified the best time and place for the abduction, and prepared the necessary equipment. On the chosen night, Harold waited outside Thomas's usual bar until closing time, then offered him a ride home when Thomas stumbled into the parking lot. The sedatives worked exactly as described in the journal. Thomas was unconscious within minutes of accepting the drugged beer Harold offered him. By dawn, Thomas Kellerman was lying in the stone circle beneath the Harris estate, still alive but unable to move or speak. Harold had expected the feeding to be quick and brutal, but what actually happened was far worse. The creature didn't simply kill and consume its victim. Instead, it seemed to drain something essential from Thomas over the course of several hours, leaving behind a withered husk that barely resembled a human being. Thomas remained conscious throughout the process, his eyes wide with terror and confusion, but his body refused to respond to his commands. When it was over, Harold disposed of Thomas's remains in a remote section of the forest, exactly as the journal had instructed. He planted evidence suggesting that Thomas had left town voluntarily, a note in Thomas's trailer saying he was heading south, charges on Thomas's credit card at a gas station near the California border, and witnesses who claimed to have seen someone matching Thomas's description hitchhiking on the interstate. The local police investigation into Thomas's disappearance lasted exactly 4 days before being classified as a voluntary missing person case. Thomas Kellerman had simply decided to start a new life somewhere else, just as he had always said he would. Harold felt sick for weeks after the first feeding, barely able to eat or sleep. But as the days passed and life in Millbrook continued, unchanged, he began to understand that what he had done was working. The creature remained contained in its basement prison, the town was safe, and one person's death had prevented the deaths of many others. This rationalization would carry Harold through the next 4 decades of killing. By the end of his first year at the Harris estate, Harold had developed a system that would serve him for the next 42 years. He divided potential subjects into categories based on their risk level and social connections, always prioritizing those who would be missed least and whose disappearances could be easily explained. Transients and drifters were his preferred targets. Millbrook was located along several major trucking routes, and it wasn't uncommon for hitchhikers and seasonal workers to pass through town. Harold would identify these individuals during their brief stays, assess their situations, and select those who had mentioned plans to move on to other locations. When they disappeared, it simply looked like they had followed through on their stated intentions. Chronic alcoholics and drug addicts formed Harold's second category. These individuals often had unstable living situations and few meaningful relationships. Their disappearances could be attributed to overdoses, accidents, or decisions to seek treatment in distant facilities. Harold became skilled at forging suicide notes and staging overdose scenes that would convince investigators that his subjects had died by their own hands. Elderly residents with no family formed Harold's third category, though he used them sparingly, and only in emergencies. When nursing home residents or isolated seniors disappeared, Harold ensured that their deaths would be attributed to natural causes or wandering incidents related to dementia. He became an expert at timing these disappearances to coincide with severe weather or other events that would make extensive searches impossible. Harold's fourth and most dangerous category consisted of what he privately called problem people, individuals whose behavior or circumstances made them potential threats to his operation. This included people who asked too many questions about local disappearances, journalists investigating cold cases, or law enforcement officers who showed unusual interest in missing person patterns. Harold used this category only when absolutely necessary, as these disappearances required the most careful planning and cover-up work. Over the years, Harold refined his methods based on experience and changing circumstances. He learned to vary his timing and location patterns to avoid establishing detectable rhythms. He studied advances in forensic science and adjusted his disposal methods accordingly. He developed relationships with local officials who could influence missing person investigations, using carefully placed bribes and favors to ensure that certain cases received minimal attention. Most importantly, Harold learned to compartmentalize his emotions and maintain his public persona as a quiet, reliable groundskeeper. He attended church regularly, participated in community events, and cultivated a reputation as someone who cared deeply about Millbrook and its residents. People trusted Harold Finch, which made his work both easier and more psychologically devastating. The creature in the basement grew larger and more powerful with each feeding. By the mid-1980s, it had nearly doubled in size, and Harold began to notice changes in its behavior. It had become more intelligent, more aware of the world beyond its underground prison. Sometimes Harold would find evidence that it had been testing the barriers that contained it, scratching at walls or manipulating objects in ways that suggested complex problem-solving abilities. These developments worried Harold, but the journal entries from previous groundskeepers assured him that this was normal. The creature's growing intelligence was actually beneficial, as it made the feeding process more efficient and reduced the risk of failed containment. A smarter creature was also a more patient creature, willing to wait for its scheduled feedings rather than attempting constant escape. The 1990s brought new challenges as advances in communication technology made it harder to stage convincing disappearances. Missing person databases became more sophisticated, and families could maintain contact with distant relatives more easily. Harold adapted by focusing more heavily on transient populations and developing more elaborate cover stories for his subjects. Disappearances. During this period, Harold also faced his first serious threat of exposure. Detective James Morrison, Sarah Morrison's father, had begun investigating a pattern of disappearances that spanned nearly 2 decades. Morrison had noticed that Millbrook County had an unusually high rate of missing persons compared to similar rural areas, and he was particularly interested in cases where no bodies had ever been found. Harold monitored Morrison's investigation carefully, using his connections within the sheriff's department to stay informed about the detective's progress. When Morrison began focusing on the Harris estate as a potential connection point, several missing persons had last been seen in the area. Harold knew he had to act. Morrison's disappearance in 1997 was Harold's most challenging operation to date. The detective was careful, suspicious, and had informed several colleagues about his investigation. Harold had to make Morrison's death look like an accident while ensuring that his research into local disappearances would be discredited or abandoned. Harold staged Morrison's death as a hiking accident in the mountains outside Millbrook, planted evidence suggesting that Morrison had been conducting an unauthorized solo investigation into drug trafficking in remote areas, making his presence in dangerous terrain seem reasonable. When Morrison's body was found a week later, the official cause of death was listed as accidental fall with contributing factors of dehydration and exposure. Morrison's research files disappeared from his office before his replacement could review them. Harold had spent months identifying and destroying copies of Morrison's work, ensuring that the pattern he had discovered would not be immediately obvious to other investigators. Morrison's colleagues assumed that his unauthorized investigation had been a personal obsession rather than legitimate police work, and no one picked up where he had left off. The Morrison incident taught Harold the importance of staying ahead of potential threats. He began monitoring local law enforcement more closely, developing informants within the sheriff's department who could alert him to any renewed interest in missing person patterns. He also started maintaining detailed files on potential threats, tracking their activities and preparing contingency plans for their elimination if necessary. By the early 2000s, Harold had been feeding the creature for over 20 years, and the psychological toll was becoming harder to manage. He had killed 93 people, each death carefully planned and executed, each disappearance meticulously covered up. The weight of those deaths pressed on him constantly, manifesting in chronic insomnia, panic attacks, and periods of deep depression. Harold began keeping a private journal separate from the official groundskeeper records, documenting his thoughts and feelings about the work he was doing. These entries revealed a man struggling to maintain his sanity while carrying out acts that violated every moral principle he had been raised with. In one entry from 2003, Harold wrote, "Saw Margaret Heinlein at the grocery store. Today she was buying birthday decorations for her grandson. I remember when I took her husband 5 years ago, made it look like he wandered off during one of his dementia episodes. She still talks about him like he might come home someday. I wanted to tell her the truth, wanted to explain that Robert died quickly and didn't suffer much. But that would only make things worse for everyone." Another entry, from 2007, "The creature spoke to me today, not in words, but I could feel its thoughts pressing against my mind while I was in the basement. It knows I'm getting old, knows I won't be able to continue this work much longer. It's already thinking about my replacement, considering the people in town who might be suitable. The thought of someone else taking over this burden should be a relief, but instead it terrifies me. What if my replacement isn't as careful as I've been? What if they let the creature grow too powerful, or fail to maintain proper containment?" Harold's growing awareness of the creature's intelligence led him to research its origins more thoroughly. He spent countless hours in university libraries and historical archives, trying to understand what he was dealing with and whether there might be alternatives to the feeding schedule. His research confirmed what earlier groundskeepers had suspected. The creature was some form of ancient entity that had been bound to the land long before European settlement. Native American oral traditions spoke of a hunger spirit that had once terrorized the region, consuming entire villages before being imprisoned by powerful shamans. The binding rituals had required enormous sacrifice, with entire tribes giving their lives to create the spiritual prison that held the creature. The Harris family had unknowingly built their mansion directly on top of this prison, and their construction work had weakened the ancient bindings. The creature had been slowly breaking free when the first groundskeeper discovered it in the 1920s. The feeding schedule wasn't just maintaining the creature, it was keeping the damaged bindings stable, preventing a complete escape. That would devastate the entire region. Harold's research also revealed why the creature required human sacrifice specifically. It wasn't just feeding on flesh, but on the life force and spiritual energy contained in human beings. Animals lacked the necessary spiritual complexity to sustain the creature, and willing sacrifices were somehow less nutritious than unwilling ones. The creature needed to consume terror, despair, and the will to live, along with physical matter. This knowledge made Harold's work even more psychologically difficult, but it also reinforced his conviction that what he was doing was necessary. Every person he killed prevented the deaths of thousands of others. The creature was a cancer that could never be cured, only managed, and Harold was the only thing standing between it and the complete destruction of everything he had ever cared about. The 2010s brought challenges that previous generations of groundskeepers had never faced. Social media made it much harder to stage convincing disappearances, as people documented their movements and maintained constant contact with friends and family. Missing person investigations became more sophisticated, with advanced forensic techniques and improved coordination between law enforcement agencies. Harold adapted by becoming even more selective about his targets and more elaborate in his cover-up methods. He learned to manipulate social media accounts to create false trails of activity after his subjects' deaths. He developed new methods for disposing of evidence that would fool modern forensic analysis. Most importantly, he began planning for his eventual retirement and the transfer of responsibility to a new groundskeeper. Finding a suitable replacement proved more difficult than Harold had anticipated. The job required someone with no close family ties, strong moral flexibility, and the psychological resilience to handle decades of killing. Harold spent years studying potential candidates, looking for someone who might be able to carry on his work without succumbing to madness or exposure. During this period, Harold also faced the most serious threat to his operation since Detective Morrison's investigation. Sarah Morrison, James Morrison's daughter, had become a detective herself and had begun reviewing her father's old cases. Unlike her father, Sarah had access to modern investigative tools and databases that made pattern recognition much easier. Sarah Morrison's investigation into local disappearances was more thorough and sophisticated than anything Harold had faced before. She had identified anomalies in missing person reports going back decades, and she was beginning to focus on the Harris estate as a potential connection point. Harold monitored her progress with growing alarm, realizing that his previous methods for discrediting investigators would not work on someone with Sarah's resources and determination. The situation reached a crisis point in 2023 when Sarah Morrison obtained a warrant to search the Harris estate. Harold had 48 hours to prepare for an investigation that could expose everything he had worked to conceal for over 4 decades. Harold considered several options, including eliminating Detective Morrison as he had her father, but Sarah had been more careful than James, sharing her research with multiple colleagues and leaving detailed records of her investigation. Her disappearance would only confirm her suspicions and trigger a more intensive investigation. Instead, Harold decided to use the search as an opportunity to deflect suspicion permanently. He spent those 48 hours carefully planting evidence that would satisfy the investigators while protecting the creature's location. He created a false basement in a different part of the estate, complete with bones and personal effects from missing persons, but ensured that the search would find nothing that definitively proved murder had taken place on the property. When Detective Morrison and her team arrived, they found exactly what Harold wanted them to find: evidence of illegal dumping and possible grave robbing, but nothing that suggested ongoing criminal activity. Harold presented himself as a victim of the Harris family's dark legacy, claiming that he had discovered the false basement years earlier, but had been afraid to report it because of threats from unknown parties. The investigation concluded that the Harris estate had been used as a dumping ground for victims of crimes committed elsewhere, possibly by a serial killer who had operated in the region decades earlier. Harold's cooperation with the investigation, and his apparent shock at the discoveries made him seem like another victim rather than a perpetrator. Detective Morrison remained suspicious, but without concrete evidence linking Harold to any specific crimes. She could only monitor him and hope for future developments. Harold knew that his time was running out, and he began making preparations for the final phase of his service to the creature. By 2024, Harold Finch had killed 147 people over the course of 43 years. Each death weighed on him, but some affected him more profoundly than others. The worst were the cases where he had been forced to target people he genuinely liked or respected, individuals whose only crime had been being in the wrong place at the wrong time when the creature needed feeding. Harold's private journal from this period revealed a man on the edge of complete psychological collapse. His entries became increasingly erratic and emotional, filled with apologies to his victims and desperate attempts to justify his actions. He wrote detailed descriptions of each person he had killed, trying to preserve their memories even as he destroyed their lives. One particularly devastating entry dealt with the death of Rebecca Walsh, a young social worker who had been investigating reports of elderly abuse in rural areas. Rebecca had been kind, dedicated, and genuinely committed to helping vulnerable people. Harold had been forced to kill her when her investigation began, focusing on several of his elderly victims, but her death haunted him more than any other. Rebecca Walsh was everything I pretended to be, Harold wrote. She actually helped people, actually made the world better. I convinced myself that I was protecting the town, but Rebecca was the one doing real protection work. When I fed her to the creature, I wasn't just killing another person, I was destroying something good and pure that could never be replaced. How many other Rebecca Walshes have I killed over the years? How many people who could have made the world better if I had found another way? Harold's deteriorating mental state began affecting his work. He made small but potentially dangerous mistakes in his cover-up efforts, leaving trace evidence that a more thorough investigation might have detected. He struggled to maintain his public persona, becoming more withdrawn and antisocial as the weight of his crimes became harder to bear. The creature seemed to sense Harold's weakness and began testing him in new ways. It started communicating with him more directly during feeding sessions, projecting thoughts and images into his mind that suggested it was preparing for a transition. The creature knew that Harold was approaching the end of his usefulness, and it was already considering alternatives to their arrangement. These communications terrified Harold because they revealed the true scope of the creature's intelligence and ambition. It wasn't content to remain in its basement prison indefinitely, feeding on whatever Harold could provide. It was planning for expansion, looking for ways to increase its power and influence until it could break free entirely. Harold realized that his decades of faithful service had not been protecting Millbrook County. They had been strengthening something that would eventually destroy everything he had tried to preserve. Every person he had fed to the creature had made it more powerful, more intelligent, and more capable of escape. He had spent 43 years as an unwitting accomplice to his own community's eventual destruction. The breaking point came on September 10, 2024, during what would prove to be Harold's final feeding session. He had selected David Chen, a homeless veteran who had been living in the woods outside Millbrook for several months. David had no family, no permanent address, and no official documentation of his presence in the area. His disappearance would barely register with local authorities. But when Harold delivered David to the basement, something went wrong. The creature, instead of beginning its usual feeding process, turned its attention to Harold himself. For the first time in 43 years, Harold felt the creature's hunger directed at him rather than his offering. The creature projected a flood of images and thoughts into Harold's mind, showing him its plans for the future. Harold saw Millbrook County consumed by an expanding zone of influence, with the creature's hunger spreading outward in concentric circles until it encompassed entire states. He saw millions of people reduced to cattle, bred and harvested to feed an insatiable appetite that would never be satisfied. Most terrifying of all, Harold saw his own role in this apocalyptic future. The creature didn't plan to kill him. It planned to transform him, turning him into something that could serve as its agent in the outside world. Harold would become the first of many servants, spreading the creature's influence while maintaining the appearance of humanity. Harold understood that he had reached the end of his usefulness as a groundskeeper, but the beginning of his potential value as something far worse. The creature had been patient for decades, allowing Harold to feed it while it slowly accumulated the power needed for expansion. Now it was ready to begin the next phase of its plan, and Harold would either serve willingly or be forced into compliance. For the first time in 43 years, Harold ran from the basement without completing a feeding. He left David Chen unconscious in the stone circle and fled to the main house, his mind reeling from what the creature had shown him. He knew that he had perhaps hours before the creature grew hungry enough to break containment and hunt for itself. Harold spent that night writing his confession, documenting everything he had done and everything he had learned about the creature. He included detailed maps of the basement, descriptions of the creature's abilities and weaknesses, and specific instructions for law enforcement on how to handle the situation safely. He also wrote personal letters to the families of some of his victims, explaining what had happened to their loved ones and offering what small comfort he could provide. Harold knew that these revelations would destroy many lives, but he also knew that the truth was the only weapon anyone would have against what was coming. On the morning of September 15th, Harold Finch walked into the Millbrook Police Department and surrendered himself to Detective Sarah Morrison. He handed over his confession, his maps, and his 43 years of carefully documented evidence. Then he sat down and waited for the world to end. Detective Sarah Morrison had been expecting Harold Finch's confession for months. Her investigation into the Harris estate had convinced her that Harold was involved in the disappearances somehow, but the scope of his confession exceeded even her worst suspicions. 147 victims over 4 decades represented one of the most extensive serial killing sprees in American history. But what made Harold's confession truly extraordinary was not the number of victims, but his apparent genuine belief that he had been protecting the community by killing its members. Harold showed no signs of the typical psychology associated with serial killers. He expressed profound remorse for his actions while simultaneously insisting that they had been necessary to prevent something far worse. Most disturbing of all were Harold's claims about the creature in the basement. Sarah Morrison was a pragmatic investigator who dealt in evidence and facts, but Harold's descriptions were so detailed and consistent that they demanded serious consideration. If Harold was delusional, his delusions were remarkably comprehensive and internally consistent. If he was lying, he was doing so for reasons that made no logical sense. Sarah assembled a team of investigators, forensic specialists, and mental health professionals to evaluate Harold's confession and plan the investigation of the Harris estate. The team included specialists in cult psychology, ritual abuse, and mass murder cases experts, who had dealt with scenarios where reality and delusion became difficult to distinguish. The initial interviews with Harold revealed a man who was clearly traumatized by decades of killing, but who showed none of the typical signs of psychosis or delusion. His memories were detailed and accurate, his timeline was consistent with missing person reports, and his knowledge of police procedures and forensic science was extensive and current. Harold Finch was either the most sophisticated liar anyone on the team had ever encountered, or he was telling the truth about something impossible. Verification of Harold's claims began with the missing person reports he had provided. Each case was cross-referenced with local records, and in every instance, Harold's information proved accurate. He knew details about the victims that had never been made public, including personal habits, family relationships, and the specific circumstances of their disappearances. More disturbing were the details Harold provided about his cover-up methods. When investigators checked several of the locations where Harold claimed to have staged evidence, they found exactly what he had described. Forged documents were discovered in courthouse files, computer records showed signs of manipulation, and witness statements contained inconsistencies that suggested coaching or bribery. The picture that emerged was of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of making people disappear without leaving evidence of foul play. Harold had essentially operated his own witness protection program in reverse, erasing people from existence so thoroughly that their murders looked like voluntary disappearances. The search of the Harris estate began on September 20th, 5 days after Harold's surrender. Sarah Morrison led a team of 12 investigators, including forensic specialists, structural engineers, and a hazmat team equipped for biological contamination. Based on Harold's descriptions, they were prepared for almost anything except what they actually found. The hidden entrance in the carriage house was exactly where Harold had indicated, and it opened using the sequence of movements he had described. The basement beyond was larger and older than any of the investigators had expected, clearly predating the mansion above by decades or possibly centuries. The air in the basement was thick and humid, carrying the smell of decay and something else that none of the investigators could identify but all found deeply unsettling. The team's atmospheric sensors detected unusual chemical compounds that didn't match any known biological processes, along with electromagnetic readings that fluctuated in patterns that suggested some form of organized activity. The stone circle that Harold had described was found in the exact location he had indicated, surrounded by scattered bones and personal effects from dozens of victims. Forensic analysis would later confirm that the bones represented remains from at least 37 different individuals, spanning an age range from teenagers to elderly adults. But it was what they found beyond the circle that truly confirmed Harold's impossible story. The team's thermal imaging equipment detected a massive heat signature deeper in the basement, something large and living that was generating far more body heat than any known animal. When they approached with floodlights, they found the creature that Harold had been feeding for 43 years. The creature was even larger than Harold had described, easily 20 feet long and several feet thick. Its translucent skin revealed the movement of internal organs that followed no recognizable biological pattern, pulsing and shifting in ways that suggested a metabolism unlike anything in the natural world. The creature's multiple limbs moved with fluid coordination, and its eyeless face tracked the investigators' movements with obvious intelligence. When the team attempted to approach closer, the creature released the sound that Harold had described, a noise that bypassed normal hearing and spoke directly to the most primitive parts of the human brain. 3 investigators immediately fled the basement, and 2 others required medical attention for panic attacks and disorientation. The creature showed no signs of aggression beyond this warning display. Instead, it seemed to be evaluating the investigators, studying them with the same careful attention that a predator might give to potential prey. Several team members reported feeling as though the creature was attempting to communicate with them telepathically, projecting images and emotions that felt foreign and disturbing. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a xenobiologist brought in to study the creature, would later describe the encounter as the most significant discovery in the history of life sciences, and simultaneously the most terrifying. The creature represented something that challenged every understanding of biology, physics, and the nature of life itself. But for the investigators, the creature's existence raised more questions than it answered. If Harold had been telling the truth about the creature, what else had he been right about? What were the implications of 43 years of human sacrifice for the creature's current capabilities? And most importantly, what would happen now that the feeding schedule had been broken? The first sign that something had changed came 3 days after the initial investigation. David Chen, the homeless veteran Harold had left in the basement, was found wandering the streets of Millbrook in a state that could only be described as profound alteration. He was physically unharmed, but his personality and mental capabilities had been fundamentally changed. David Chen had entered the basement as a traumatized LARGELY, nonverbal man suffering from severe PTSD and addiction issues. He emerged as someone completely different, articulate, calm, and possessed of knowledge that he should not have had. When questioned by investigators, David displayed detailed understanding of the creature's history, its needs, and its plans for the future. More disturbing was David's apparent lack of concern about his situation. He showed no fear of the creature, no anger about his kidnapping, and no interest in leaving the Harris estate. Instead, he expressed a desire to help investigators understand what they were dealing with. Speaking about the creature with something approaching reverence. "It's not malevolent," David explained during his initial interview. "It's just hungry, like any living thing. The difference is that it's been imprisoned for centuries, forced to survive on whatever scraps it could obtain. Harold was actually showing it mercy by providing regular feedings. Without that schedule, it would have no choice but to hunt for itself." David's transformation represented something that Harold had never mentioned in his confession: the possibility that the creature could alter humans rather than simply consuming them. This ability suggested a level of biological manipulation that exceeded anything in known science, and it raised terrifying questions about the creature's ultimate goals. Dr. Warren's examination of David revealed changes that were both subtle and profound. His brain activity showed patterns that were unlike anything in medical literature, with new neural pathways that appeared to be facilitating some form of enhanced communication or consciousness. His blood chemistry included compounds that didn't match any known biological processes, and his tissue samples showed cellular modifications that suggested active ongoing transformation. Most significantly, David appeared to be serving as some form of intermediary between the creature and the outside world. He claimed to be receiving constant communication from the creature, including detailed information about its past, its needs, and its intentions. Through David, the creature was apparently attempting to negotiate with the investigators for a new arrangement that would allow it to survive without causing harm to the broader community. These negotiations revealed the creature's true intelligence and the sophistication of its long-term planning. It had apparently been studying human society for decades through its interactions with Harold and previous groundskeepers, developing an understanding of political, economic, and social systems that would allow it to integrate more effectively with the modern world. The creature's proposal was both reasonable and terrifying. It offered to limit its feeding to volunteers, terminally ill patients, elderly individuals ready to die, criminals condemned to death in exchange for official recognition and protection. It claimed to be able to provide valuable services to humanity, including medical knowledge derived from its unique biological capabilities and insights into consciousness and life force that could revolutionize science. But underlying this reasonable facade was the clear implication that cooperation was preferable to the alternative. The creature was no longer contained in its basement prison, and it had demonstrated abilities that made traditional law enforcement responses inadequate. If humanity chose not to negotiate, the creature would simply take what it needed, and the results would be far more destructive than Harold's careful feeding schedule had ever been. Within a week of the investigation's beginning, the creature's influence began spreading beyond the Harris estate. Investigators who had spent extended time in the basement started experiencing what Dr. Warren termed cognitive contamination, changes in behavior, personality, and thinking patterns that suggested ongoing exposure to the creature's telepathic abilities. These changes were initially subtle. Affected individuals reported unusual dreams, increased empathy for the creature's situation, and growing conviction that cooperation rather than containment was the most rational response to the crisis. As the effects progressed, some investigators began actively advocating for the creature's proposals, arguing that humanity should accept its offer of partnership rather than attempting to destroy or imprison it. Dr. Warren recognized these symptoms from her research into parasitic organisms that could influence host behavior. But the creature's methods were far more sophisticated than anything in nature. Rather than simply controlling its subjects, it appeared to be gradually converting them to its perspective, allowing them to retain their personalities and free will while fundamentally altering their priorities and values. The contamination effect spread through proximity and extended contact, making it impossible to study the creature safely using traditional methods. Investigators who spent more than a few hours near the basement found themselves increasingly sympathetic to the creature's needs, while those who tried to maintain distance struggled to maintain objectivity about the threat it represented. Sarah Morrison found herself caught between her duty to protect the public and her growing understanding that traditional law enforcement responses were inadequate for the situation. The creature was not a criminal who could be arrested or a wild animal that could be relocated. It was something entirely outside normal categories of threat or response. Meanwhile, the creature's influence continued expanding. Residents of Millbrook began reporting unusual dreams and experiences, particularly those who lived closest to the Harris estate. Several individuals came forward claiming to have received telepathic communications, offering them the same kind of transformation that David Chen had experienced. More disturbing were reports of people voluntarily traveling to the Harris estate, apparently drawn by some form of mental compulsion. These individuals were not being coerced in any traditional sense. They genuinely believed that visiting the creature would benefit them somehow. Some sought healing for terminal illnesses, others claimed to be responding to spiritual calling, and a few simply expressed curiosity about the entity that had been living beneath their community for decades. The creature accepted some of these volunteers, transforming them into intermediaries like David Chen. Others were apparently deemed unsuitable and sent away unharmed, though they retained a lasting fascination with the creature and its goals. A small number were consumed entirely, their life force and knowledge adding to the creature's growing power and understanding. Each feeding made the creature stronger and more capable of influencing the world beyond its basement. Its telepathic range expanded, its physical capabilities increased, and its understanding of human psychology became more sophisticated. Within 2 weeks of Harold's confession, the creature had essentially become the dominant force in Millbrook County, with hundreds of residents falling under varying degrees of its influence. Word of the situation at the Harris estate reached federal authorities within days of the initial investigation. The combination of multiple missing persons, an active serial killer confession, and reports of an unidentified biological entity triggered protocols that brought together representatives from multiple agencies. The federal response team included specialists from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the Centers for Disease Control, the Department of Defense's Chemical and Biological Defense Program, and several classified agencies whose involvement could not be officially acknowledged. Their mandate was to assess the threat level, determine appropriate containment measures, and coordinate with local authorities to protect public safety. The federal team's initial assessment confirmed investigators' worst fears. The creature represented a threat that exceeded all existing contingency plans and response protocols. It was simultaneously a biological hazard, a psychological warfare agent, a potential weapon of mass destruction, and an intelligence asset of unknown capabilities. Military specialists who studied the creature's abilities concluded that conventional weapons would be ineffective against it. The creature's biology was so different from terrestrial life that standard biological or chemical agents would likely have no effect. Its telepathic abilities made it nearly impossible to approach safely, and its apparent immortality meant that even successful attacks might only temporarily disable it, rather than destroying it permanently. More problematic was the creature's growing network of human allies and intermediaries. Any attempt to destroy the creature would necessarily involve attacking American citizens who are acting voluntarily, even if their volition had been influenced by telepathic manipulation. The legal and ethical implications of such action were staggering, particularly given the creature's apparent willingness to cooperate with human authorities. Dr. Margaret Kim, the federal team's lead xenobiologist, summarized the situation in her initial report. "We are dealing with an entity that represents humanity's first contact with genuinely alien intelligence. It possesses capabilities that exceed our current scientific understanding and has demonstrated both the willingness and ability to integrate with human society. The question is not whether we can destroy it, we probably cannot, but whether we can coexist with it on terms that preserve human autonomy and dignity." The federal response evolved from containment to negotiation as the scope of the creature's capabilities became clear. Direct military action was ruled out due to the risk of civilian casualties and the low probability of success. Instead, the team focused on establishing formal diplomatic contact with the creature through its human intermediaries. These negotiations revealed the creature's sophisticated understanding of human political and legal systems. It was prepared to accept formal recognition as a sovereign entity, subject to international law and treaty obligations. In exchange, it offered to limit its activities to voluntary interactions with humans, and to share its advanced biological and psychological knowledge for the benefit of humanity. The creature's proposals included revolutionary medical treatments, insights into consciousness and mental illness, and technologies based on biological rather than mechanical principles. It claimed to be able to cure cancer, regenerate damaged tissue, and extend human lifespan dramatically. In return, it asked only for recognition of its right to exist, and a sustainable supply of willing volunteers to maintain its metabolism. While federal authorities debated policy responses, the creature continued expanding its influence throughout Millbrook County. What had begun as isolated incidents of telepathic contact evolved into a systematic transformation of the entire community's social and economic structure. The creature's human intermediaries established what they called the Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to facilitating cooperation between the creature and human society. The Foundation purchased properties throughout Millbrook, established research facilities, and began recruiting volunteers for various forms of interaction with the creature. Some volunteers sought healing for medical conditions that conventional medicine could not address. The creature's biological manipulation abilities allowed it to treat cancer, regenerate damaged organs, and cure genetic disorders with remarkable success. These medical miracles drew attention from around the world, bringing researchers, patients, and curiosity seekers to Millbrook in ever-increasing numbers. Other volunteers were interested in the consciousness enhancement procedures that had transformed David Chen and other intermediaries. The creature could apparently modify human neural architecture to enable telepathic communication, enhanced memory, and expanded cognitive capabilities. These procedures were irreversible and fundamentally altered the subject's relationship with both the creature and normal human society. But they were genuinely voluntary and produced dramatic improvements in mental capacity. A third category, or volunteers, offered themselves as traditional food sources, providing the life force and biological material that the creature required for survival. These individuals were typically terminally ill patients who preferred to die in a way that would benefit others, or elderly people who had made peace with their mortality and wanted their deaths to have meaning. The Foundation maintained strict protocols for all volunteer interactions, ensuring informed consent and psychological evaluation before any procedures were undertaken. No one was coerced or deceived about the nature of their involvement, and many volunteers reported that their experiences with the creature were profoundly meaningful and spiritually fulfilling. Within 6 months of Harold's confession, Millbrook had been transformed from a declining rural community into a thriving center for biological research and consciousness studies. The creature's knowledge and capabilities attracted scientists, philosophers, and researchers from around the world, creating an economic boom that benefited the entire region. Local residents found themselves caught between fear and fascination as their community changed around them. Some welcomed the prosperity and opportunities that the creature's presence brought, while others worried about the long-term implications of coexisting with something so fundamentally alien. A significant number of long-time residents chose to relocate rather than adapt to the new reality. The creature seemed to understand and respect these concerns, making no attempt to prevent people from leaving if they chose to do so. Its influence was compelling rather than coercive, offering genuine benefits to those who chose to engage while respecting the autonomy of those who preferred to maintain distance. Harold Finch spent his remaining time in custody trying to process the consequences of his confession. The world he had sought to protect through 43 years of killing had been transformed beyond recognition, not by the creature's escape but by its integration with human society. In many ways, the outcome was better than anything Harold had dared to hope for during his decades of service. The creature was no longer a hidden threat requiring constant human sacrifice, but a recognized entity operating within legal and ethical frameworks. The people of Millbrook were no longer unknowing potential victims, but informed participants in a relationship that offered genuine benefits along with genuine risks. But Harold struggled with the knowledge that his decades of killing had been unnecessary. The creature had apparently always been capable of surviving through voluntary cooperation rather than predation. Harold's assumption that it required unwilling victims had been based on incomplete understanding and fear rather than accurate assessment of the situation. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the psychiatrist assigned to Harold's case, spent dozens of hours trying to understand the psychological mechanisms that had sustained him through 43 years of murder. Harold's case was unique in the literature of serial killing, involving neither sadistic pleasure nor delusional justification, but genuine belief that his actions were necessary to protect others. Harold Finch represents something we've never seen before, Dr. Hernandez explained in her report. He's a mass murderer motivated by altruism, a killer driven by love for his community rather than hatred or psychopathy. His crimes were terrible, but his motivations were genuinely noble. Understanding how someone can commit such acts while maintaining their fundamental moral compass has implications for our understanding of human psychology, social responsibility, and the nature of evil itself. Harold's journal entries from his final months revealed a man trying to find meaning in a lifetime of actions that had turned out to be based on false premises. He wrote extensively about his victims, trying to honor their memories and acknowledge the full scope of what he had taken from the world. "I told myself that each person I killed saved dozens of others," Harold wrote in one of his final entries. "I believed that their sacrifice was necessary and meaningful. Now I know that they died for nothing, that there was always another way if I had been brave enough to look for it. I can't undo what I've done, but I can make sure that everyone understands the full cost of fear and ignorance." Harold Finch died in custody on March 14, 2025, 7 months after his confession. The official cause of death was heart failure, but those who knew him believed that he had simply lost the will to continue living with the weight of his unnecessary crimes. His death was mourned by an unlikely coalition of victims' families, law enforcement officials, and even some of the creature's intermediaries who recognized the genuine tragedy of his situation. Harold had been both a monster and a victim, a man who had sacrificed his soul to protect a community that had never asked for his protection. The events at the Harris estate fundamentally changed humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. The creature's existence proved that Earth was not the only world to develop intelligent life, and its abilities suggested that consciousness and biology could evolve in directions that human science had never imagined. The integration of the creature into human society proceeded gradually and carefully, with extensive oversight from international organizations and scientific institutions. The Foundation continued to facilitate voluntary interactions while conducting research into the creature's biology and psychology. Medical advances derived from the creature's knowledge revolutionized treatment for dozens of conditions, saving thousands of lives and dramatically improving quality of life for millions more. The consciousness enhancement procedures it offered provided new insights into human psychology and cognition, leading to breakthroughs in education, mental health treatment, and cognitive enhancement. But the creature's presence also raised profound questions about human autonomy, identity, and the nature of consciousness itself. The intermediaries it created were still recognizably human, but they had been fundamentally altered in ways that made them different from baseline humanity. Their numbers grew. They began to form a distinct community with its own culture, values, and perspectives. Some observers worried that humanity was unconsciously allowing itself to be absorbed by something alien, trading its independence for benefits that might ultimately prove to be forms of subtle control. Others argued that cooperation with the creature represented humanity's next evolutionary step, an opportunity to transcend the limitations that had constrained human development for millennia. Detective Sarah Morrison continued to investigate the cold cases that Harold's confession had finally resolved, providing closure to families who had waited decades for answers about their missing loved ones. Her work became the foundation for a comprehensive study of Harold's methods and motivations, contributing to improved understanding of how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil. The Harris estate was eventually converted into a research facility and memorial, honoring both the creature's ancient presence and the victims of Harold's misguided protection efforts. Visitors could learn about the full history of the site, from its origins as a Native American sacred site through its transformation into humanity's first embassy to an alien intelligence. Harold Finch's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of acting on incomplete information and the importance of questioning assumptions, even when those assumptions seemed to be supported by evidence. His 43 years of killing demonstrated how good intentions could lead to monstrous actions when combined with fear, isolation, and incomplete understanding. 5 years after Harold Finch's confession, the world had adapted to the reality of non-human intelligence in ways that few people had anticipated. The creature beneath the Harris estate was no longer unique. Its presence had apparently encouraged other hidden entities to reveal themselves, leading to a cascade of first contact events around the globe. ITY found itself part of a larger community of conscious beings that had always existed but had remained hidden due to fear, misunderstanding, or simple lack of opportunity for communication. Each species brought unique capabilities and perspectives, creating opportunities for cooperation and growth that transformed human civilization. The Millbrook model, as it came to be known, became the template for integrating non-human intelligence into human society. The principles of voluntary cooperation, informed consent, and mutual benefit established at the Harris estate were applied to dozens of similar situations around the world. But the transition was not without its challenges. Some humans struggled to adapt to a reality where they were no longer the dominant intelligence on Earth, while some non-human entities had difficulty understanding or respecting human values and autonomy. Conflicts arose that required new forms of diplomacy and conflict resolution. Harold Finch's legacy lived on in the protocols and safeguards established to prevent similar tragedies in the future. His story was taught in schools and training programs as an example of how fear and incomplete information could lead well-intentioned people to commit terrible acts. The creature beneath the Harris estate became something of an elder statesman in the growing community of revealed intelligences, using its experience with human psychology to facilitate communication and understanding between species. It maintained the memorial to Harold's victims as a reminder of the costs of misunderstanding and the importance of approaching the unknown with courage rather than fear. Rebecca Chen completed her investigation into Harold Finch's story with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. She had uncovered the truth behind one of the most complex criminal cases in history, but that truth raised more questions than it answered about human nature, moral responsibility, and the price of survival. In an uncertain world, the final entry in Harold's journal, discovered after his death, perhaps best captured the tragedy and complexity of his situation. I spent my life trying to protect people from a monster, only to discover that the real monster was the fear that prevented me from seeing any alternative to murder. I hope that those who come after me will be braver than I was, wise enough to seek understanding rather than assuming the worst, and strong enough to find solutions that don't require sacrificing the innocent. The creature was never the enemy. Ignorance was, and ignorance is the one monster that we always have the power to defeat. The story of Harold Finch and the Harris estate serves as a reminder that truth is often more complex than it appears, that good intentions can lead to terrible consequences, and that the greatest horrors are sometimes committed by ordinary people who believe they are doing the right thing. It challenges us to question our assumptions, seek understanding rather than making judgments based on fear, and remember that even the most alien intelligence might have more in common with us than we initially realized. In the end, Harold Finch's 43 years of killing proved to be unnecessary, based on misunderstanding and fear rather than genuine necessity. But his story also demonstrates the profound human capacity for self-sacrifice, even when that sacrifice is misguided. Harold Finch was neither hero nor villain but something more complex, a man who loved his community enough to damn himself for its protection, and who ultimately chose truth over self-preservation when he realized his mistake. The basement beneath the Harris estate is no longer a prison or a feeding ground, but an embassy where humanity continues to learn about the vast complexity of consciousness and life in the universe. And in that transformation from place of horror to place of hope, perhaps Harold Finch finally found the redemption that eluded him in life. The knowledge that his final act of courage had helped create a better world than the one he had tried so desperately to protect through decades of necessary evil.